Story 1. No one tells you that a big part of being a parent is helping your kids with their fears. It's not about your own fears, but theirs. A shadow in the corner, a noise at night, a bit of dust they think is a spider. There's always something. You try not to get annoyed, even when it's the third time they've woken you up this week. You remind yourself that kids see things differently. Their imagination gets the best of them. You tell them there's nothing to be scared of, that it's all in their head, and most of the time you're right. Most of the time. It all started with my son, Alex. He just turned 8 last month, and I thought we were done with the whole scared of the dark thing. Monsters under the bed, shadows that move when they shouldn't. I thought he'd outgrown all that. Alex has always been a bit scared of things, and he still sleeps with a nightlight, but he isn't a baby anymore. He plays Minecraft like a pro, beats tough video game bosses without a problem, and is on his way to becoming a Pokemon master. But one night, he came into my room, holding his Bulbasaur stuffed toy like it was his only friend. "There's something under my bed," he whispered, his voice shaking just enough to make me worried. I sat up, rubbing my face. "Alex, you're too old for this." He looked at me with wide eyes. "I know," he said, almost like he was sorry, "but I think it's real." I sighed and threw off the blankets. It was late, too late for this kind of thing, but something in his face made me take him seriously. "All right," I said, standing up. "Let's go check, together." Alex hesitated, looking toward the door. "Can you bring the flashlight?" I almost rolled my eyes, but his quiet, shaky voice stopped me. Alex wasn't the type to ask for help easily. He was better than me at some games and often had to help me out. "Fine," I said, grabbing my phone and turning on the flashlight. "Let's go see this monster." He followed me back to his room, holding my arm like we were going into a battle. When we got there, everything looked normal. He had enough Pokemon stuffed toys to fill a daycare, and most of them were piled on his bed like a tiny army protecting him at night. His Nintendo Switch was on the desk, still charging from earlier. His Pikachu blanket was half crumpled on the bed, and his Pokemon plushies stared at us from their usual spots, their stitched smiles oddly comforting. But the bed, it felt different. I couldn't explain it. Maybe it was the way Alex stood in the doorway, refusing to step inside, or maybe it was how the air seemed colder and heavier. I shook off the feeling and crouched down. "See? There's nothing here," I said, shining the flashlight under the bed. The light showed the usual mess, a couple of stray Lego bricks, one of his Minecraft books, and a few Pokemon cards. I turned to him. "No monsters, Alex. Just some stuff you should probably clean up." Then I saw it. A shape, small and dark, moving just out of the light's reach. I froze. The shape didn't move like something alive. It didn't scuttle or slither. It just shifted, like it was deciding what to be. "Dad," Alex whispered from the doorway. His voice was barely a sound. I wanted to tell him it was nothing, that it was just a trick of the light. I wanted to laugh and say, "Look, it's your imagination again." But my throat felt tight, because for the first time I wasn't sure. "Stay there, Alex," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. He stayed in the doorway, holding his stuffed Bulbasaur, when a sleepy voice cut through the room. "What's going on now?" I turned to see his older brother, Nate, sitting up on the top bunk, looking down at us. He rubbed his eyes, looking annoyed. "It's late. I've got math tests tomorrow, and Alex is doing the monster thing again. Dear God, he's 8 already, Dad." Alex glared up at him, his lip trembling. "It's not a thing. I saw something." Nate groaned and turned on the light next to his bed, filling the room with a bright white glow. "See?" he said, waving his arm. "No monsters. Just a mess, like always." I looked back at the floor. Under the bright light, the room looked normal. Messy, yes, but normal. The pile of books by the desk, the heap of Legos spilling out of their bins, even the shadows under the bed had disappeared, gone in the light. "Go back to sleep, Nate," I said, trying to sound firm but tired enough to avoid an argument. "Maybe Alex should go to sleep too," Nate muttered, lying back down on his pillow. "He's the one freaking out." I shot him a look, but Alex didn't seem to notice. He was still staring at the bed, his knuckles white against Bulbasaur's green fur. "Dad," he whispered, "I'm not lying." My chest felt tight. "I know, buddy," I said softly. "Let's just check one more time, okay? Together." Alex nodded slowly, and I crouched down again, shining the flashlight under the bed. Nothing. Just the usual stuff. More books, more Legos, a stray Pokeball plush. I felt Nate's eyes rolling from the top bunk without even looking up. Told you. Enough, Nate, I said. Alex tugged on my sleeve. But it was there, Dad, I know it was. I opened my mouth to respond when Nate cut in again, sitting up quickly. Can you guys not do this right now? I've got a math test in the morning, and you're scaring the crap out of him for no reason. That was the night things changed. We all went back to bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. Alex wasn't the type to make things up, and I couldn't ignore what I'd seen. The shape, small and dark, shifting just out of the light's reach. It stayed with me, making me question what was really under my son's bed. I'm not scared, Alex snapped, his voice shaking. Enough, I said louder than I meant to. Both boys went quiet, and the only sound was the faint hum of the air purifier. Everyone back to bed, I said firmly. Now. Nate grumbled and lay back down, pulling the blanket over his head. Alex hesitated but slowly went back to his bed, still holding on to Bulbasaur. I stayed there for a minute, looking at the empty space under the bed. Everything looked normal. But as I turned to leave, I felt like something was watching me. For the next couple of weeks, everything seemed fine. Alex stopped waking me up at odd hours. Nate didn't complain about losing sleep. It was like the whole monster under the bed thing never happened. Life went back to normal, or as normal as it can be with two boys. Alex got busy with Minecraft and Pokemon battles, while Nate kept up his 12-year-old know-it-all attitude. I even started to believe I imagined the strange shadow under the bed. But then Alex came to breakfast one morning, scratching his arm a lot. Stop that, I said, giving him a plate of eggs. You're going to make it worse. It's itchy, he whined, holding out his arm. Tiny red bumps were all over his skin, like mosquito bites. It's the weather, Nate mumbled with his mouth full of toast. You always get that when it's dry out. He was right. Every winter, Alex's skin got dry and itchy, and we had to put lotion on him a lot. It was annoying, but normal. Nothing to worry about. Mum grabbed the bottle of moisturizer and gave it to Alex. Here, put some of this on and stop scratching. Alex groaned but did as he was told, rubbing the lotion on his arm. Over the next few days, though, it got worse. The bumps spread up his arms and down his legs. One morning, he woke up with deep red scratches on his shoulders, like he had been clawing himself in his sleep. It's just dry skin, I told him when he showed me, though even I didn't believe it anymore. The scratches looked too clean, too neat. Do you think it's bed bugs? My wife asked that night, looking into Alex's room like she expected to see a lot of insects on the floor. Maybe, I said, though I'd already checked the sheets and mattress. There was nothing, not even a speck of dirt. Maybe he's scratching himself in his sleep, she suggested, looking at his nails. If he's scratching at night, he might be hurting himself. That made sense, but something didn't feel right to me. The scratches were too clean and sharp, like they were made by something else, something with claws. I didn't tell her that, of course, but I could tell she didn't really believe he was scratching himself either. The next morning, Alex looked worse. He had dark circles under his eyes and barely touched his food. What's wrong, buddy? I asked, trying to sound cheerful. He shrugged. I couldn't sleep. Nightmares again? He shook his head. No, not really, but I heard it. My heart sank. Heard what? The scratching, he said, looking at me with scared eyes. It's back, Dad. I know it is. Nate snorted from across the table. It's probably mice or something. But Alex shook his head. It's not mice. It's the monster. I know it is. Nate just looked at him with annoyed eyes. Kids can do that to you. Sometimes you have a meeting early in the morning, and the last thing you want to do at night is look for monsters under the bed. Mum said she would clean today and get rid of whatever was scratching under their beds. That night, I decided to check on Alex. Not because I believed him, but because I didn't know what else to do. I waited until both boys were asleep, then quietly went into their room with a flashlight. I knelt by Alex's bed and pulled the blankets back carefully. His arm was around Bulbasaur, his tiny chest moving up and down steadily. Everything looked fine. And then I heard it. A faint scratching sound like nails dragging across the floor. I froze. The sound was coming from under the bed. I didn't want to look. Every part of me wanted to back away, to wake Alex and Nate, to run, but I couldn't leave without knowing. If I walked away now, the sound would stay with me. It would keep scratching in my mind until I went crazy. I slowly lay down on the floor, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The scratching sound got louder, more persistent, as if it knew I was listening. The beam of light lit up the shadows under the bed. At first I saw the usual stuff, a couple of crumpled Pokemon cards, a lost sock, and a smaller pile of Legos. But then I saw it. A hand. It was pale, almost see-through, with long, thin fingers tipped with black, sharp nails. It was pressing against the floor, scratching slowly, almost thoughtfully. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. The hand stopped. Slowly, it slid back into the darkness, disappearing where the flashlight couldn't reach. I jumped up, hitting my head against the bottom of Alex's bed frame. I put my hand over my mouth to stop a scream. My heart was pounding so loud I thought it would wake the boys. "Dad?" The whisper made me jump. I turned around quickly and saw Alex sitting up in bed, rubbing his eyes. "Go back to sleep," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. "What are you doing?" Nate mumbled from the top bunk. "Nothing," I said quickly, too quickly. Alex looked at me, his face pale in the dim light. "It's back, isn't it?" "No," I lied. "Nothing's back, just go to sleep." He didn't look convinced, but he lay back down, hugging Bulbasaur so tightly I thought the seams might burst. "Can I sleep with you tonight?" he muttered. After a moment of thinking, I said, "Get in bed with your brother." Nate barely moved to make room for his little brother, as they had slept together before. I backed out of the room, leaving the door open just a little. My mind was racing as I walked to the kitchen. I grabbed a glass, filled it with water, and leaned against the counter, trying to stop my hands from shaking. What did I just see? It couldn't be real. Things like that don't exist. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe Alex's nightmares were getting to me. Maybe too much stress, too much work and too little sleep were messing with my head. But deep down I knew better. The next morning, Alex had more scratches. This time they weren't small. 4 long parallel marks ran down his back, jagged and raw. "What happened?" I asked, turning him around to look more closely. "I don't know," he whimpered. "I woke up like this." Nate walked in, yawning. "What now?" "Look," I said, pointing to Alex's back. Nate blinked, then frowned. "Maybe he's scratching himself." "I'm not!" Alex cried. "I told you, it's the monster!" I gave Nate a warning look, and he held up his hands. Okay, it's not him. Chill. It wasn't me either. I slept like a baby." I crouched down to Alex's level, my hands on his small shoulders. "Listen, buddy," I said. "Are you sure you're not scratching in your sleep? Maybe without realizing it?" He shook his head furiously, his eyes filling with tears. "It's not me. It's real. Why won't you believe me?" I started, but I couldn't find the right words. What could I say? That I did believe him, that I'd seen something under his bed, that whatever was making these marks wasn't human. Because I knew deep down that was the truth. That night I couldn't sleep. I stayed up, working and preparing for an early morning meeting, every creak of the house sending a jolt of fear through me. I kept hearing Alex's voice in my head. "Why won't you believe me?" The truth was, I did believe him. I just didn't want to admit it, not to him, not to myself, because if I admitted it, then I had to face it, and I didn't know how. At around 2 a.m., I heard it again. The scratching. It was faint at first, like a distant echo, but it grew louder, more frantic, until I couldn't ignore it. I ran to the boys' room. The door was open. The room was pitch black, the small nightlight flickering weakly. "Alex," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Nate." No response. I stepped inside, feeling for the light switch. My fingers brushed the wall, but before I could flip the switch, the nightlight went out completely. The scratching stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then, a low, growling sound filled the room. My stomach dropped. I turned on the flashlight on my phone and aimed it at the bunk bed. When I finally got it on, I flashed it on Nate's pale face, his eyes wide with terror. "Dad," he whispered, "it's under the bed." I didn't think. I dropped to my knees and shone the light under the bed. What I saw made my blood run cold. It wasn't just a hand this time. The thing under the bed was crouching, its body twisted and long, its skin a sickly see-through grey. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and its mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin filled with jagged, uneven teeth. It moved, jerking its head toward me, its bones cracking with every motion. Its grin widened, and it made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a snarl. I froze, too scared to move. "Dad!" Alex's scream brought me back. The thing jumped toward me. I scrambled back just as it reached for me, its claws scraping against the floor. It moved so fast, too fast, disappearing into the shadows. Nate jumped down from the top bunk, landing beside me with a thud. He grabbed my arm, his voice shaking. "What is that thing?" "I don't know," I said, pulling him close. "Where's Alex?" "He was here," Nate said, his voice breaking. "I swear he was right here." My heart pounded as I looked around the room, the flashlight moving over the beds, the walls, the floor, and then I saw it. The closet door was open a little. Something moved inside, shifting the clothes on their hangers. "Alex!" I called, my voice breaking. No response. I stood, gripping Nate's arm tightly. I stepped toward the closet, every part of me wanting to stop, to turn around, to run. I reached for the door handle and pulled it open quickly. Alex was there, curled up in the corner, his arms around his knees. He looked up at me, tears running down his face. "It tried to take me," he cried. "It tried to pull me under the bed." I picked him up, holding him tight. "It's okay," I lied. "You're safe now." But I knew we weren't. My wife came rushing in, looking scared. How could I explain this to her? Nate did a better job explaining, and Alex just sat there in shock as Mum held him like a baby. Every time Nate said something like, "The monster took Alex into the closet," and it looked weird and had no clear shape, my wife would turn to me and I would just nod. She took the kids to our room. I stayed for a moment, not knowing what to do next. Then I turned off the light switch, and as I turned to leave the room, I felt it. A cold, bony hand touched my ankle. I ran. We spent the rest of the night in our room, all four of us huddled together on the big bed. The boys eventually fell asleep, but I stayed awake, holding a kitchen knife and watching the shadows move on the walls. "What are we going to do, dear? I'm scared. Please, do something. Call the cops or a priest or someone," my wife said, scared and upset. But who would believe us? After all, we didn't believe Alex. In the daylight, it was easier to pretend nothing had happened. But Alex's scratches didn't go away. They got worse. By the end of the week, his arms and legs were covered in raw, angry marks. The doctor couldn't explain it. She said it might be an allergy, maybe stress. She gave us creams and medicines, but nothing worked. Then Nate started waking up with scratches too. The final straw came when Alex showed me his Pokemon toys one morning. Their seams were ripped and their stuffing was coming out, but it wasn't just from playing. They were torn apart on purpose, like something with claws had done it. I sank to my knees, holding Alex. "I'm sorry," I whispered, holding back tears. "I'm so sorry." He looked at me like he understood that I was doing my best, but it wasn't enough. He hugged me as tight as he could. That night, I blocked the boys' room. I pushed the beds against the closet door, filled the closet with boxes, and taped the edges of the door shut. The kids slept with us again. I couldn't leave them alone after dark. But it didn't matter, because at 3 a.m. I woke up to Alex screaming. We all did, but then it suddenly stopped, and everything was silent, and he was gone. My wife and I ran to their room. The barricades were still in place, the closet door was still shut, but Alex wasn't there. "Alex," I whispered. Nothing. Then I saw it. The closet door was slightly open, and something, a dark shape, moved inside. "Stay here," I said to my wife, my voice shaking. She didn't stay. She grabbed my arm and moved with me. I walked to the closet slowly, every part of me wanting to run, but I couldn't. "Alex," I called again, louder this time, getting closer. Then, the closet door flew open. Alex wasn't inside, but what was there made my stomach twist. A large, twisted mass of limbs and pale, stretched skin. It was crouching there, staring at us with wide, hungry eyes, its mouth stretched open wide, showing jagged, uneven teeth. I couldn't breathe. My wife screamed, "What is that? What is that thing?" I could barely speak. My throat was tight with fear. "I don't know," I whispered. Before I could react, it jumped at us. The thing screamed, but it wasn't its voice. No, it was Alex's voice. It sounded exactly like him, calling to us from somewhere in the back of the room. "Mum, Dad, help me!" I turned, but there was nothing there. When I looked back, the creature was gone. Nate was right behind us now. "What was that? Where is Alex?" "I don't know," I said, my hands shaking. "I don't know what it is, but it's real, and it took him." "Stop!" my wife shouted, pulling away from me. Her face was red, and she was breathing hard. "Stop! Stop! I can't handle this. I can't! We need to tell someone, and no one will believe us." I grabbed her by the shoulders, making her look at me. "This isn't a joke. There's no explanation. Whatever's under that bed, it's real. Her face crumpled, her eyes filling with tears. But how do we fight it? How do we stop it? I didn't know. And then I heard it again, Alex's voice. Mum, Dad, please. It was coming from inside the walls. That's when I realized we weren't safe. None of us. The room was silent, painfully silent. For a moment I thought I had lost my mind. My wife was still crying, but there was nothing else. No growls, no scratching, no Alex, just stillness. I don't know how long it took, but eventually the front door burst open. I don't know if it was me or my wife, but we both rushed toward it. The hallway was dark, like walking through a tunnel. My heart was still pounding, my hands shaking, but I didn't care anymore. We ran, rushing down the stairs toward the front door, and there, just outside the door, standing as if nothing was wrong, was Alex. He was standing there, his back to us, his small body lit by the faint light from the hallway. I almost collapsed right there, feeling both relief and terror. Alex, I said, my voice breaking. My mouth was dry, and I could hardly speak through the lump in my throat. He didn't turn around. He just stood there, facing the door, not moving. Alex, his mum called again, softer this time. Please, we've been looking for you, baby. He finally turned around, and I can't remember if I screamed or cried. He looked like Alex, but not. His face was the same, his clothes were the same, but his eyes, those eyes, they were too wide, too dark, and they didn't have that spark of life anymore. They were cold and empty. You wouldn't believe me, huh? Alex said, his voice low. Too low. It sounded like it was coming from far away, like it wasn't his voice anymore. His lips curled into a twisted, hollow smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. You never listened to me, did you? I couldn't move, I couldn't speak. That thing had taken him. But it didn't just take his body. It took the light inside him, the part of him that was my son. And now, standing before us, he was something else, something we couldn't even understand. His mum reached out, her trembling hand stopping just short of touching his shoulder. Alex, baby, please. He didn't move, he just stood there staring. You won't believe me, he repeated, his voice softer now but colder, almost disappointed. I told you. He was gone, not physically but worse, and the thing, was it gone? But we knew. We knew something was still watching us. The thing, whatever it was still in our house, still in Alex. We can't escape it. It had made its home here, and now we had to believe it. Story 2. I thought it was a polite way of rejecting me when I got the email saying I was shortlisted for the fire lookout position. It seemed like a thanks but no thanks message, because who would leave in the middle of the season after getting that job? But apparently, someone did, and if I could get there by tomorrow, the job was mine. When I got the call, I was on my way to work. I finished my drive, walked into the trashy dive bar where I worked as a server, and told them I was quitting because I found something better. I grabbed whatever non-perishable food I had at home and drove through the night. The lookout tower was a drive-up type, so I could afford to be a bit tired on my first day since I didn't have to hike in. I like to think I hid my tiredness pretty well when Ranger Mike showed me around. The first stop was the cabin where I'd be staying. It was small but cozy, and I was happy to see it had running water and a shower. I tried not to yawn as we explored outside in the warm sun. There was a small meadow before the forest started, but a few steps into the trees, I saw something that woke me up completely. There had been a fire here recently. Everything was grey and brown, and the few trees that were still standing looked like they could fall at any moment. The area looked like a big scar compared to the green forest around it. Oh wow, I said. Is this why the last lookout left? It's crazy how close this must have been to the tower. No, Robbie stayed after the fire. We got him out hours before it reached here, Mike said. Robbie got scared by the animals. We think there might have been a bear that got burned in the fire. We're not sure if it's still around. So I wanted to talk to you about safety before I leave. I imagined a scary, half-burned bear wandering around the woods. For the first time, I thought about how alone I was going to be out here, but I pushed that thought away. This was what I signed up for. So that's why Robbie left, I asked. Yeah, he had some kind of encounter late at night and it scared him. Not everyone can handle being out here alone. I wanted to ask more questions but decided to wait for the safety talk. I wanted to prove that I could handle being alone out here. I didn't want Mike to think I'd get scared and leave because of a bear. When we climbed the long steps to the tall tower, all my worries disappeared. The view from the top was amazing. The burnt section of the forest made the green part look even more vibrant in contrast. I felt like I could handle anything if this was my reward. The mountains looked like they went on forever. The rest of the orientation went smoothly. I had filled in as a volunteer a few times before, so Mike thought I could handle the job. Things got a bit strange near the end when Mike was giving me the safety talk back in the cabin. We talked about bears and what to do if I saw one. There wasn't much that I didn't already know, but Mike seemed hesitant when I tried to ask more about why the last guy left so quickly. I wanted to know if the bear had tried to attack him or the cabin. Mike avoided my questions for a bit before finally saying, "Look, sometimes after a fire, the bears, deer, and even squirrels act a bit strange. It can be unnerving. You're out here alone, and the wildlife, some of which can hurt you, is acting weird. It can be too much. I could tell you some stories about what guys in this job say they've seen after a fire, and you wouldn't believe it." "Like what?" I asked. "I don't want to scare you with ghost stories and nonsense when you're about to start your first big job, kid." "I don't mind." "Really, it's nothing, and I should be going anyway," Mike said, gathering his papers. "Just watch yourself, okay? And keep an eye on the animals. They might be acting strange because that fire was just last week." "What should I watch for?" I asked. "Just anything strange. You'll be all right, kid." With that, Mike left me alone. I had the rest of the day to settle in. I didn't bring much with me in the rush, thinking I'd go home the first weekend to get more things. I had my sketchbook, and Robbie left plenty of books. He was supposed to come back and get his stuff, but I figured he wouldn't mind if I borrowed his books in the meantime. He also left a sleeping bag crumpled up in the tower, which made me uneasy. It looked like he left in a hurry. After getting the lay of the land, I decided to take a quick nap in the cabin, but I didn't wake up until the sun was setting. I rushed up to the top of the tower, glad I hadn't missed my first sunset. There were only a few clouds in the sky, but the fog rolling in from the west gave a bright haze in the hills. I watched the orange sky turn pink, feeling peaceful for the first time since I arrived. But just as the sun was setting behind the distant ridge, I saw something on a far peak. The treetops were moving in a line, like something was jumping from branch to branch. I grabbed the binoculars from the top of the bookshelf, only to find both lenses cracked. Worse, there were brownish-red stains on the cracks. I dropped them quickly. I had my own binoculars in my bag, but I hadn't brought anything upstairs yet, so I squinted to see what I could. There was a dark, smooth shape moving along the tops of the trees. It looked big, maybe a marten or a bear cub. But the strange thing was, it didn't seem to stop jumping, but I was far away, and the fog had thickened with the setting sun, so maybe I just couldn't see it well. The way it moved was so smooth, almost like it was floating, confident enough not to pause. As it reached a small clearing in the forest, I stopped blinking, ready to get a better look when it had to jump to the ground. But to my surprise, the creature did not drop down when it reached the clearing. Instead, 4 long, shadowy legs stepped out from the trees. It hadn't been jumping on the treetops. It was just that tall. I watched as the creature started to come out of the woods, but just as I thought I might get a good look at it, it turned its head to look at me. Its round head on its long neck moved quickly, and even from miles away, I knew it was looking at me, because I could see its glowing orange eyes staring right at me. I quickly ducked down, hiding below the window. I stayed like that for a long time, well past sunset. When my heart stopped racing and my hands stopped sweating, I finally convinced myself that I had imagined the whole thing. I managed to make myself walk, not run, but walk calmly down the steps to my cabin, as a sane person would. That first night I didn't sleep at all. When dawn came, I started setting up my stuff. I wanted to clean up the cabin a bit before the morning check-in. I put Robbie's things in a corner, so they were tidy for when he came back to get them. I spent some time looking at the map on the Firefinder, and saw 2 of the other lookout towers marked on the edge of my map. There were 5 towers in this forest, and it was comforting to know that there were other people out here, even if they were far away. The Firefinder spun okay and seemed to be in good condition, but I didn't like that Robbie had drawn X's all over the glass covering the map with a grease pencil. He had also circled a few spots near the cabin frantically, which I didn't appreciate. Just as my mind started to connect the X's with what I had seen the night before, I decided to erase them. I wasn't going to let some crazy guy ruin my time here and mess with my head. I erased all his marks and tried not to think about the locations. The morning meeting was uneventful, but it was nice to see some friendly faces, even if it was just over a video call. Everyone welcomed me to the team, and although they all seemed nice, I was too tired to remember most of their names. The first day passed without any issues, as did the first week. I found myself settling into a routine and calming down after that first night. We had Wi-Fi in the tower, but I tried to pretend that we didn't, except for the meetings, of course. I wanted to learn how to unplug, so I started reading Robbie's books until I could get some of my own from home. He had mostly horror paperbacks, but as you'd expect from a fire lookout, there were nature books too. My favorite was a field guide about the trees in the area. They were mostly pines, but I hadn't realized how many different kinds of pines were in the forest. I started taking the field guide with me and tried to identify and sketch the different trees when I was off duty. It was especially interesting to walk through the burnt area and see what was already growing in the ashes of the old forest. Many of the trees had thick bark and tall branches, dropping the ones closer to the ground as they grew to be more fire-resistant. Other trees had fire as part of their life cycle, with new shoots growing near the base of old trees after a fire. My favorite adaptation was something called serotinous cones. These pine cones would stay closed for years, even decades, waiting for a fire to open them and release their seeds. I didn't see any fires in that first week, and after 10 days it was time for my weekend. We worked 10 days on and had 4 days off, so I had plenty of time to go home and pack properly. On the drive back, I was excited about leaving civilization more permanently. My excitement quickly disappeared when I saw someone waiting for me at the cabin. I thought he might be a hiker, so I greeted him warmly. "Hey man, how's it going?" I asked. "You're my replacement," he said. It wasn't a question. Then it clicked, and I noticed the backpack he had. Robbie must have come back for his stuff. "I guess I am. Nice to meet you." I held out my hand, but he didn't shake it. "I'm just going to say what I need to say, okay?" he said. "Okay." "They're lying to you, Mike and the other lookouts. There's something weird going on here, and I wanted to warn you because it's the right thing to do. I know you won't believe me, and that's okay." "Robbie," I said, "what did you see that made you leave?" "I saw a bear watching me sleep," he said simply, then pointed up at the tower. "It was watching me sleep from up there." "What do you mean? From the tower?" I laughed a little. "Robbie, that's not possible." I said what I needed to say, and now I'm leaving. He pushed past me and I called after him, but he just got in his car and drove away. That night, I slept up in the tower, not because I was afraid of what might be out there, but because I wanted to look at the stars. What Robbie said was so absurd that it actually made me feel better about the whole situation. Over the next week, I saw my first storm from up in the tower. It was both glorious and terrifying. I spotted my first fire, but when I radioed it in, Mary, the girl to the east of me, had already spotted it. I used the firefinder to help pinpoint it, and it felt good to be doing the job I came here to do. As summer went on, I explored the forest around the tower more. I brought some watercolors with me after that first week and spent a lot of time painting, drawing and reading. But more than that, I spent time just sitting in the tower, staring out at the mountains, even when I wasn't on duty. It was so easy to get lost in watching the forest move. I felt more at peace than I ever had in my life. Growing up in the city, you'd think I'd be used to living in a crowded place, but everything was so loud, and I could never force myself to be a people person. I always felt like there was something a bit off about me that made people uneasy. I could never achieve that kind of effortless camaraderie that everyone else seemed to have. I had friends and relationships, but it always felt different compared to how others interacted. I'd catch girlfriends watching me intently, as if they were studying me, trying to figure me out. Even friends of many years were never as close to me as they were to each other. But out here, none of that mattered. It was just me and the forest. Sometimes the other watchers would call in, wanting to chat, and more often than not, I found myself ignoring them. Wasn't the point of coming out here to get some peace and quiet? I started spending my weekends venturing farther into the forest, going on all-day hikes. One day I decided to follow the burned area as far as I could. By then, there were many new saplings coming up, enough to cover most of the forest floor with a sprinkling of green. Aside from the sunny weather, the hike wasn't too different from my others, until early afternoon when I found something strange. I noticed it because it was being propped up on one side by a sapling struggling under a patch of fur. It was a bear carcass, or part of one anyway. The hide was definitely there, so my first thought was that someone had skinned the creature, but they'd made a mess of it. The fur wasn't cut in any pattern, but it didn't look like the creature had just decomposed. There was still blood in places. I thought maybe someone had killed it for food, and that's why they didn't care about the hide. But that didn't make much sense. It would be much less risky to hunt any other animal. I tried looking for the skull, thinking it would be neat to bring back to Ranger Mike, so I started digging around in the loose fur. I noticed a distinct lack of bones and flesh right away, so I started to think again that I had just found a badly skinned hide, but then I saw a flash of white among the ash. Then my brain registered for the first time just how much ash was on the remains, like it had been here before the fire, or perhaps killed by the fire, but that didn't make any sense. The fur would be burnt up. I dug through the ash and found a tooth, which led to more teeth. Then I found something squishy and realized I'd found an eyeball. Another quick dig rewarded me with the other one, and I didn't know what to make of my discovery at all after that. I examined some more of the skin, and it looked less and less like a knife had made the cuts. It was like the bear had exploded, with jagged shreds all around the edges of the pieces. I went back home after that, convinced that there was some kind of mysterious thing happening here, and I wanted to get to the bottom of it. I felt like an explorer on the edge of some great discovery. That night I slept in the tower while a storm raged outside. It was exhilarating. I woke up just as the sun was beginning to rise and grabbed my binoculars. It was a foggy morning, and off in the distance I saw a familiar sight. There was a dark, shadowy creature moving in the forest. It was closer this time, and it looked shorter than it had before, despite being nearer. The beast was on all fours, and its stocky form made me wonder if it was the same creature I'd seen last time, or if there were more of these beasts out there. It stood up on its hind legs and looked at me from 3 peaks to the west, its eyes burning like the morning sun. Then it fell back on its feet and started heading towards me. Good, I thought, let it come. I lost sight of it when the morning mist cleared. I went about my day as usual after that. I spotted a small fire, but it turned out to just be a campfire in an unauthorized area. That night at sunset, I sat perched in my tower, watching for anything that might be watching me back. I soon spotted the beast much closer to me now. It wasn't as tall as the first creature I'd seen. This was definitely a different beast, and it had a humped back. Its eyes were the same flickering orange, but as it got closer, I couldn't make out anything else about it. It looked like a moving shadow, but as it moved, the trees seemed to move with it. By the time it reached the tower, it was dark, but it had gotten close enough for me to make out some details. It reared up on its legs again and peered into the tower, blocking out an entire side of the building. It had a round head, like the first beast, but an elongated mouth, almost like a snout. It blended into the night, so it was hard to see too much, but when it opened its mouth, I saw only more darkness. The creature didn't have fur or skin or anything solid. It didn't look quite real, and it was hard to make out any features. But what I could see for sure, as it sniffed and panted at my window, was that it did not have any teeth. I wondered if it was looking for the ones I'd brought home with me. After that, I knew what I had to do. It was another week before we had another fire. After I called it in and got the coordinates, I rushed to my car. Something incredible was happening, and I needed to see it for myself. I parked on an incline close enough to see, but not close enough to be seen, and hopefully not close enough to get burned. I hiked as close as I dared and watched from a distance as helicopters fought the blaze. This was a small fire, and it was pretty clear they wouldn't have any problems, so I started to walk closer. I had come prepared with a respirator, but the smoky smell in the air was still strong. I waited until the helicopters left, then I moved in to examine the ashes. I could see the entire burned area was contained along just a small part of the mountainside. They'd gotten to it quickly, and the recent rains probably helped slow its spread. By the time I found what I was looking for in the smouldering embers, it was nearly sunset, and my head hurt from the smoke, but it was worth it. Lying among the smoking embers and ash was a snakeskin, but it wasn't shed, nor burned. It was ripped up. I dug around in the still warm ash at one end and found tiny white teeth. Carefully, I started sifting around with my fingers for something soft, but this took longer. I finally found my prize about a foot away, as if it had been flung. Buried in ash, yet completely intact, was a single tiny eye. That night, I slept like a baby up in my tower, and when I awoke, I was greeted with a new friend in the distance. At the very edge of my vision, along the farthest peak to the south, was a shadow. This one stood on 2 feet, and as it walked, its arms swayed to the sides. I stopped drawing in my sketchbook and started to write down my theories. Whatever was going on, I wanted to be the one to document every minute of it. When the other watchers called me, my excuses for why I couldn't chat became less and less polite, and soon I stopped picking up completely unless it was during work hours. I didn't have time for them. I had far more important things to do. This led to Ranger Mike paying me a visit, on my day off no less. The nerve of some people. He claimed he just wanted to check up on me, and that he was worried because I hadn't been socializing much. I told him that I was just really enjoying my alone time, but that I would try to be more friendly. He tried to get into my tower, pretending he wanted a morning cup of coffee, but I politely refused, saying I had a lot to do that day. I couldn't let him see my collection. Things were going well until I got my first hiker. Then they were going even better. His name was Luke, and he had wandered over from his friends, who were apparently camping nearby. The old tower by the visitor center handled most of the tourists, but we were still supposed to be friendly when any wandered by our towers. Luke was very friendly. Too friendly. He and his friends were definitely either drinking or smoking, and I couldn't help but judge them for letting him wander off alone. Luke was too out of it to be any trouble to me, so I figured there was no harm in showing him around. Of course, he wanted to see the top of the tower, so I walked up behind him, ready to catch him if he stumbled. He spent a good 15 minutes staring out the windows without saying a word, which made me like him a bit. High or not, this was a man who appreciated nature. I gave him the speech I had prepared for tourists, and though I hadn't used it yet, I still had it memorized. I told him about how there used to be thousands of these towers almost a century ago when the program was founded. Fire watchers would try to stop any and every fire from burning until they realized that that was actually harming the environment. Regular burns were needed to use up the dry brush and prevent the really big fires. It was part of the natural cycle, and we weren't meant to stop it entirely, all the usual history stuff. But then I started to tell Luke about some of my own ideas. I think actually that we should let the fires burn even more, I told him. Right on, he said. He'd been saying things like that the whole time, and to be honest, it was starting to annoy me a bit. I think that if we let the fires burn more, we could learn something about ourselves and our place in nature. I started to point to some of my research, which I had taped to the walls below the windows. See, I have a theory that some animals and even people need fire to live out their complete life cycle, just like the pine trees do. They don't become what they're really meant to be unless they burn. I can't figure out why it's only some animals, though, and why it's different ones. But I've been wondering if maybe the ones who need it weren't really what they were pretending to be in the first place. I pointed out the drawings I'd done of the human-like creature on the ridge. Or maybe they're chosen to become something different because they're special. That's the theory I like best. But Luke didn't like that. He didn't like my ideas. Hey, that's cool, but I should be getting back to my friends. I could see his eyes focusing more like he'd realized something was wrong, and he was trying to ground himself in reality. His eyes darted nervously over my collection, as if he was worried the eyes on the bookshelf were looking back at him. I took him down the steps and brought him to where he'd wandered out of the woods. He noticed for the first time the spot where I'd been having my bonfires. Isn't there like a burn ban right now? He asked, his unease replaced by curiosity now that we were out of the tower. There is, but don't worry, I'm only burning things to make them better. Luke didn't know what to say to that. He threw me a peace sign and wandered back into the woods. Soon I could hear voices in the distance. His friends must be close by, very close by. The next day I woke up to several pairs of burning eyes watching me from outside my tower, and several new fresh pairs inside of it. The creatures outside couldn't speak, but I knew what they wanted. It was time for me to join them. I started at my bonfire pit, then went all around the cabin, trailing gasoline. Then I splashed a lot of it on the dry brush at the edge of the woods. Finally, I trailed a generous amount up the stairs with me to make sure I couldn't change my mind. Lastly, I poured gasoline on my research along the walls. I realized that the outside world wasn't ready for what I had discovered, but that didn't matter. As I lit the match, my friends outside began to vanish with the morning sun, but that was okay. I would be with them soon. I dropped the match to the floor and closed my eyes for the last time. I was ready to find my new skin, my new eyes, and become what I was truly meant to be. Story 3. I want to be a Boy Scout, Dad, my little boy shouted at me from across the table, practically smashing his hand into the cake as he leaned over. Oh yeah, I said enthusiastically. What changed your mind, little man? I heard Carson talking about it at school today. It sounded really fun. He was practically shaking with excitement. What did I tell you about hanging out with Carson? His mood went from excited to timid. Leo, you know how I feel about him, especially his language. You're only in 5th grade, for Christ's sake. But you swear all the time, Daddy, Leo said matter-of-factly. You know it's different when I do it. I'm a grown-up and you're a kid. Now shut up and make a wish, smart Alec, I said with a chuckle. He stuck his tongue out at me playfully, then closed his eyes and blew out the candles. He looked back up at me, and I immediately knew what he wished for. So that night, when the sugar rush turned into a sugar crash, I signed Leo up for Scouts. I didn't tell him until about a month later, on the day of his first meeting. We were about 3 months into the school year, so Scouts had already started. Luckily, I had a friend on the school board who owed me a favor, so sign-ups weren't an issue. Why are we back at school, Dad? My son asked, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. I had told him we were going to see a movie, and he'd fallen asleep almost as soon as the car left the neighborhood. Your first Scout meeting, of course, I said, turning to face the back seat. His eyes left mine and went to the uniform I was holding in my hand. Holy crap, Dad, he shouted, snatching the uniform from me, undoing his seatbelt and opening the door almost simultaneously. Whoa, 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 buddy, aren't you forgetting something? I almost had to shout because he was halfway to the school entrance. He turned and shouted, Love you, dude. Love you too, lil dude. He turned and sprinted through the doors and into the gymnasium, disappearing from my sight. You're a cool kid, you know that? I said, almost complimenting myself in a weird third-person conversation. I pulled my baseball hat over my eyes, reclined the seat, and fell asleep. Dad, guess what? He said, slamming the car door as he got in. Holy cow, you scared the hell out of me, kid, I said, trying not to choke on my heart, which was still lodged in my throat. What's up? My first camping trip is next weekend. We learned all about the old Native American tribes that used to live here, and we are going to visit a reservation next weekend. Camping and learning at the same time. How can you say no to that? That's some really exciting news, kiddo. The camping trip was the only topic of discussion for the entire next week leading up to his trip. When I went to drop him off at the school, I could almost taste the peace and quiet of an entire weekend. You got everything you need packed in that bag, right? You double-checked? I asked in a sad tone. Yes, Dad, he said with an eye roll. All right then, get out of my sight and go have a good time. He grabbed his bag resting on the seat next to him and rushed over to stand in line by the bus with his other Scouts. There were 6 kids and 2 Scoutmasters. I knew both fairly well, so I felt a sense of comfort knowing they'd be watching my kid. I knew he was in good hands. After a beer and pizza-filled weekend, it was finally time to pick up my son. The New Mexico traffic was especially horrible. Of all days, today had to be the worst. We literally have a desert in our backyard. Why was there so much traffic? On top of my commute frustrations, I was late to the pickup. The bus was gone, and so were the other kids. All that remained was a Scoutmaster and my son. I immediately knew something was wrong. The man had a concerned look on his face while looking at Leo, and Leo had no expression on his face at all. He just stared straight ahead, occasionally blinking but out of rhythm as if he forgot how. I'm sorry I'm late, lil dude. Traffic was terrible, I said, guilt seeping into my voice. He said nothing at all, just silently walked to my car. As I examined him, I noticed numerous things were off. For starters, when he took a step, he almost tripped over his own foot. Secondly, his fingers looked slightly longer than when I last saw him. When he got to the car door, he just stood there and looked at it like he'd never seen it before. Figuring he was upset about me being late, I got out and opened the door for him. He then gave a slight nod to himself, like he'd just learned something new. I closed the door behind him and walked over to the remaining Scoutmaster. Hey, Kevin, how was the camping? I asked, trying to act like Leo wasn't being completely strange. It was fine, Vince, but something happened with Leo. 2 hours after we arrived, he started asking if anyone heard the woman in the forest. Thinking it was just his imagination, everyone laughed it off. Later that night, one of the kids saw him walk into the sandy nothingness and immediately came to wake me and George up. We followed his tracks until we reached 2 rocky hills with a ravine in between. Then the tracks stopped. We searched until morning with no luck. When day broke, we retreated back to the reservation campsite. Leo was sitting in the sand when we got back. We all asked him questions. but he never answered. He didn't make a noise for the rest of the trip, not even on the bus ride home. Maybe you'll have better luck talking to him. I'm really sorry about all this, Vincent. I looked at him with a mix of rage, confusion, and anxiety. As long as my boys are not hurt, that's all that matters to me. I'll see if I can get him talking and let you know what he says. Thanks for getting my son home safe. I quickly turned around and walked back to the car, starting the engine. On the drive home, I kept questioning Leo about his trip, but just like Paul said, there was no response. Not at dinner, and not even before bed. So when I heard him talking to himself in his room that night, I couldn't help but listen. Hello? It was Leo's voice, but it sounded deeper and as if he had something stuck in his throat. You're not Carson. What's that smell? This strange conversation went on for about 30 minutes, then it suddenly stopped. After waiting a bit to make sure it stayed quiet, I quietly opened his door. Leo was lying on his side, facing the window, covered up to his neck in blankets. His breathing was slow and deep, so I thought he was asleep. I watched his breathing until I was certain he was out. Then I closed the door just as quietly as I had opened it and went to bed. The next morning, I saw that Leo was still in bed, in the same position as the night before, still covered in blankets, breathing slowly and deeply. Wake up, sleepyhead. It's almost noon. As I walked to where his head was, I saw his eyes were wide open and unblinking. They moved from the window to meet mine, still unblinking. Are you okay, Leo? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite my unease. He just stared at me coldly and without emotion, confused and worried. I went back to my room to call a doctor, but after 30 minutes of searching, I couldn't find my phone. I could have sworn I left my phone on the nightstand, I muttered, scratching my head. I went back to Leo's room and asked him, Did you take my phone? You know the rules about stealing. He just looked at me with the same cold stare. Clearly, something was wrong with my son, and it was my job to make sure he was all right. I waited in the living room all day, hoping Leo would come out of his room. Prodding him didn't work, so I decided to be patient. After a long yawn, I checked the time on the microwave. 10:26 p.m. Bedtime, I said, yawning again. I turned off the lights as I went down the hall. I passed Leo's door and didn't hear a sound, so I assumed he was asleep. I stripped down to my boxers and flopped onto my bed. You're not Carson. Hello? My son's voice slowly pulled me from my sleep. I realized it wasn't coming from his room anymore. It seemed to come from all over the house. It moved from the hall to the living room and kitchen, then back again. At first it was almost inaudible, but I could hear footsteps when he returned from the kitchen. It sounded like someone walking on all fours through my house. Just like before, it stopped suddenly. After waiting for a while, I mustered the courage to open my door. I turned on the hall lights and went to Leo's room. I opened the door quickly and found him lying in the same position as the night before. I know you're not sleeping, Leo, I said in my stern parent voice. Expecting his eyes to be open, I was surprised to find them closed. He was actually asleep. This didn't comfort me. It made me more uneasy. Am I losing my mind? Is this a midlife crisis? I wondered, trying to make sense of everything. After hours of restless tossing and turning, I finally fell back asleep. I woke up to the faint sounds of a breeze and birds chirping. I thought I might have left the window open, but it was closed. Listening closer, I realized the sounds came from Leo's room. I rushed to his door. The window was open, and Leo was gone. Panicking, and with my phone still missing, I ran to the key ring by the front door. My keys too? Are you serious? I shouted in frustration. Desperate, I got dressed and went to check the backyard. Out here, backyard means the desert, stretching for miles with only the occasional tree. If someone took Leo, there would be tracks. But I found nothing, only the tracks of a coyote circling a few miles away. Shouting for Leo didn't help. Even if he heard me, I doubted he would answer with how he had been acting. I ran back to the house, feeling even more desperate. When I reached the front door, it was open. Fear took over as I drew my gun. I searched the house corner to corner, my gun ready. When I opened Leo's door, I lowered the gun. He was standing on his bed, looking out the window. His clothes were dirty and covered in red-orange sand, but what struck me most was that his shoes were missing and his arms looked longer. His fingers nearly reached his thighs, even though he was standing straight. Leo, I stammered. Part of me wanted to raise the gun again, but the other part still saw my son. At the sound of my voice, he slowly lay down and covered himself with blankets. I rushed to him, wanting to see his face. His hair was dirty, and his cheeks and forehead were filthy. His lips were cracked and pale. Near his hairline, I saw a small cut with a dark, thick trail of blood, like it had been there for a while. But that was impossible. I had just seen his face the other day, and it was fine. "How did you get this, buddy? Where did you go?" I asked softly, lightly touching the wound. As soon as I touched it, his eyes shot open, filled with anger. I froze and quickly pulled my hand back. Leo sat up in bed, staring at me with an angry expression. "Sorry, Leo, I didn't mean to hurt you. I was just checking it out," I said timidly. He said nothing, just kept staring at me unblinkingly, almost threateningly. As I slowly made my way to the door, I felt his eyes burning into the back of my head. When I finally closed the door behind me, I heard him lay back down. I felt so stuck. I had no way to contact anyone outside the house. If I told the neighbors, they'd think I was crazy, or, even worse, that I'd hurt my son. I spent the entire day weighing my options until I noticed it was almost midnight. Knowing the time seemed to make my body realize it was time to rest. My anxiety and fear were slowly replaced by exhaustion. On my way to my bedroom, I paused to make sure Leo was sleeping. Hearing nothing, I assumed he was, so I went to lie down in my bed. "Tomorrow, I'm going next door to tell Frank. I don't care what he'll think. I just want to help my boy," I said, tears welling up in my eyes. Having a plan eased my mind enough to fall asleep. I woke up shivering, despite having all the blankets on me. "Jesus, it's freezing," I said through chattering teeth. It was 2:43 a.m. I threw on some sweatpants and a hoodie and headed to Leo's room. His bed was empty, but the window was still closed. As I walked down the hall, my heart nearly stopped when I saw the front door wide open. My phone was lying on the porch. I quickly grabbed it, shut the door, and locked it. I placed the phone on the kitchen island and turned on the lights. "What the heck is happening?" I yelled, rubbing my hands through my hair frantically. I remembered Leo wasn't in his room. "Hello?" I heard Leo's voice coming from the backyard. I rushed to the window and saw him standing about 200 feet away, staring into the dark desert. This time, his proportions looked even more strange. His knuckles were scraping the ground as his small frame stood straight. I let out a soft whimper, followed by a quiet, "What the heck?" "You're not Carson," I heard him say. I watched in horror as Leo bent down until he was on all fours. His extended arms and legs made his back arch in an impossible way. He crawled around on all fours, repeating the same phrases over and over again. The sound of my phone ringing made me jump. Paul was calling. I quickly picked up. "Vincent, what the heck?" "Man, I've been trying to reach you for days." "Paul," I lost my phone. "I just found it. What's going on?" After we talked, I told the locals on the reservation about the 2 hills I saw. They sent a young man down the ravine, and he immediately screamed for us to pull him back up. When we did, he was a mess, speaking incoherently until he switched to a different language. The locals looked terrified, and one of the elders told me to call the tribal police. 6 squad trucks arrived with climbing gear and biohazard bags. They brought up 14 bags full of something. One of the officers asked if I had lost a kid out there. I told him yes, but that he had been found soon after. He looked confused and told me they found hundreds of piles of organs, muscles, tissue, and bones of various shapes and sizes, but one was the size of a child's, matching the time of Leo's disappearance. "Vince, that thing isn't Leo." I hadn't said a word the whole time. Sitting in shock, I realized the voices were gone. I looked out the window and saw nothing. Leo was gone. "Paul, I have to go," I said sternly and hung up. I dialed 911 as quickly as I could. When the police arrived, I told them everything. They looked at me like I was crazy, but I told them I had multiple people to back me up. But I never heard from Paul again. He just disappeared. His car was found in his driveway with the key in the ignition. No one could corroborate my story, and the locals told the police nothing. It's been 5 years since I last saw my son. I miss him every day and cling to the hope he'll come back, even though I know it's unlikely. But lately, I've been hearing a familiar voice, almost like Paul's. At first, it was just incoherent rambling from the empty desert behind my house, but over time, it became clearer and closer. Last night, I finally understood what I was hearing. In Paul's voice, I heard, "You're not Carson." Story 4. I stare at my beautiful daughter, Leia, who is giggling in the corner of our small living room. Something about her imaginary friend, Kippy, feels strange to me. Marcus, my partner, pulls my chair closer and kisses my head, trying to reassure me. It's okay, Mare. It's just a phase, he says, not too worried. Leia continues to giggle, clutching at the air as if holding someone's hand. Her laughter is melodic but unsettling. Kippy loves playing with me, Mama, she suddenly says, talking to someone invisible. He says I'm his favorite. Marcus squeezes my hand and tries to calm me down. Mare, don't overthink this. She's just a kid with a big imagination. I lean forward, trying to understand what Leia sees. Who is Kippy, Leia? What does he look like? I ask, trying to keep my voice steady. Leia tilts her head, confused. After a moment, she whispers, Kippy says you already know. I shiver involuntarily. Marcus notices and says more firmly, it's just a phase. Leia, come here, baby. Leave Kippy for a bit and sit with us, I say, my voice trembling. Leia's giggle stops abruptly. Her face changes, something dark and disturbing appearing. Kippy says he doesn't like you, Mama. Marcus laughs nervously. Kids say the weirdest things, don't they? But I can't take my eyes off Leia. Her posture stiffens, and her gaze flickers back to the empty corner. He loves me more, she says defiantly. Marcus stands up, trying to change the mood. All right, Leia, let's give Kippy some space. He probably needs a nap. Leia screams, piercing and sharp. Kippy doesn't nap. He says you'll never make him go away. Marcus freezes, his face pale. Leia, what's wrong? He asks. She clutches her arm and bursts into tears. Her arm is red with deep, angry scratches. My blood runs cold. What happened? I demand, fear in my voice. Leia sobs. Kippy got mad because you don't believe in him, Mama. Marcus stares, wide-eyed, losing his composure. Mare, that looks bad. What did she do? Did she scrape against something? I didn't do anything, Leia shrieks. It was Kippy. He's mad, Mama. He's so mad. Marcus and I exchange a look. This isn't normal. That night I barely sleep. Leia is between Marcus and me, trembling. The scratches on her arm seem to pulse under the bedside lamp. Marcus whispers urgently, Mare, we should take her to a doctor, maybe a child psychologist. I nod, but my mind races with questions. Could we afford treatments? What if they had to take Leia away? How do you explain the scratches and Kippy? Around 3 a.m., I hear a faint tapping sound from the corner of our bedroom, the same corner Leia had stared at earlier. Marcus, I whisper, shaking him awake. Do you hear that? He groans. What is it now? Listen, I say. The tapping stops. Before Marcus can reply, Leia screams awake. She's huddled in bed, terrified. The room is unnaturally cold and the air smells of sulfur. He's here, Mama, she whispers. Kippy's here. Marcus sits up, shaking Leia. This is enough. Leia, stop this nonsense. But the room grows colder. Suddenly Marcus is thrown out of bed, crashing into a wall. I scream, pulling Leia into my arms. Marcus groans, struggling to his feet, his face etched with fear. Leia, baby, we have to leave now, I say. We can't stay here. I carry Leia and rush to Marcus. What the fuck, Mare? Marcus says groggily. No questions, just follow me. We are leaving now. Marcus nods, and we head to the bedroom door, but it slams shut on its own. The sound is deafening. Marcus holds me tighter, realizing the seriousness of the situation. The air is still. My heart pounds, and I clutch Leia tighter. Marcus stares at the door, tense and ready to fight. The room feels alive, closing in on us. Marcus yanks at the door handle, but it doesn't budge. Open this damn door, he yells, desperate. Leia giggles softly. Kippy likes when you're scared. Marcus turns to her, pale. What did you just say? Leia. I try to calm her. Leia, baby, Kippy might not be nice. We have to tell him to leave us alone. Kippy doesn't want you to go, Leia says calmly. He wants to play.